Hey, everybody. I am a grateful and enthusiastic member of Codependents Anonymous. My name is Richard. I'm codependent as hell. Today, I am a codependent with boundaries. I am delighted to be here. It's an honor to be asked to share anywhere in Codependents Anonymous, but I've come to really appreciate and love this CoDA Arizona events group. And yeah, I'm enthusiastically here anytime that they ask. 3 weeks ago, we talked about how to be sponsored. And today we're going to flip the switch and we're going to talk about how to sponsor. And I'm going to ask a couple of things before we get started. First of all, as many of you know, anytime that I do something like this, I like to start with a particular prayer. It speaks to my illness, and it's called the set aside prayer. So if you would just indulge me for a second. Higher power, help me today to set aside the things I think I know. Help me to set aside everything I think I know about you, everything I think I know about myself, everything I think I know about other people, and everything that I think I know about this program. Also, that I can have a new experience in you, a new experience in myself, a new experience in my fellows, and a new experience in my own recovery. Thank you for listening. Let's talk about this idea of how to sponsor. First of all, I want everybody to understand something, and that is that every sponsorship relationship is unique. I'm not an expert on sponsorship. Sponsorship is an intensely personal relationship between two unique individuals. And what that looks like every time. This is a relationship between two unique individuals. So, my relationship with any two sponsees that I have is going to be different just because that person's different. How do we learn to sponsor? Most of us learn to sponsor by watching our sponsor. We learn to sponsor the way we are sponsored. That is, in my opinion, the best way. I can tell you that I am currently on my third sponsor. My first sponsor was a guy that was long on unconditional love and acceptance. He looked just like Santa Claus. He had this really deep James Earl Jones kind of voice. So he looked like Santa Claus, sounded like God kind of deal. And he was exactly what I needed at that time because I was so fragile. But he was not long on direction. And after I had soaked in that love and acceptance for a while, I needed some direction in this program. And so I went to him and I said, thank you for everything that you've done for me. And I need to go with this guy now. And I got my second sponsor, and he was pretty good at giving direction for a while. And then he just kind of drifted away. He stopped showing up in my meetings. He stopped returning my calls. And I found myself in the need for another sponsor. And so at that time, I was heavily involved in a couple of service gigs that where I was the speaker getter for a conference. The person who's responsible for recruiting conference speakers. And funny thing, if you're doing that kind of service and you need a sponsor, there's this committee will have a budget. They'll fly somebody into town for you to interview as a potential sponsor if that person is willing to stand at a podium for an hour. And my current sponsor was the third guy that I flew into Saskatoon specifically because I thought he might make a good sponsor, but he was also a good conference speaker. And Jack got off the plane, and he did. If you ever meet my sponsor, you'll find that he has this Bluetooth earpiece that's all but surgically attached to his ear. And he did what he does. He got off the plane. Before I even introduced myself, he had put that Bluetooth earpiece in, and he was taking phone calls from sponsees in California. And I traveled with him for the weekend, driving around Saskatoon to go into the conference with him, hanging out with him, watching him taking those calls. And it was like my own personal weekend clinic and sponsorship. And there was no, at that time in my recovery, the thing I was working on was trying to learn to be a better sponsor myself. And there was no question in my mind that this was my guy. And he's been my sponsor for a little over 10 years now. What I'm going to talk about today is stuff that works for me for the most part, because that's what we have to share here is our experience. So I need to preface by telling you that anything I say today, your mileage may vary, right? And if I talk about something that works for me that is completely at odds with what you do in your sponsorship relationship, what your sponsor does, what you do with your sponsees, this is not intended as a criticism for you or for what of you or of what works for you. Because of that idea that this is an intensely personal relationship between two unique people. I can talk about the stuff that works for me in my sponsorship relationships, and maybe that'll work for you. And if so, I hope you find it helpful. I talked at the last session about sponsorship being the catalyst of recovery. The catalyst being that substance that, when introduced, either initiates or accelerates a chemical reaction. And for me, getting a sponsor was a huge catalyst in my recovery. My recovery really didn't go anywhere until I got a sponsor. When I got a new sponsor, it took off again. When I got a new sponsor after that, it took off again. But the other side of that equation is also true. Becoming a sponsor was a huge catalyst in my recovery. In fact, in my mind, it is the big deal in my recovery. We talk here about doing the work. And when we talk about doing the work, we're usually talking about working the steps. And I've come to the perspective that the first 11 steps are not the work. The first 11 steps are the things that I need to do in order to qualify myself to do the work, which is the 12th step. What is sponsorship? At the end of the day, what sponsorship is two people sharing a journey. Two people walking in the same direction of getting better. One of those is more familiar with the path than the other. That's it. In sponsorship, what's in it for me? Our booklet on sponsorship, it talks about sponsorship as a three-way partnership between the sponsor, the sponsee, and a loving higher power. But let's talk for a second about what sponsorship isn't. As a sponsor, I am not a therapist. I have no training as a therapist. I'm not licensed anywhere. I do not want to open a legal can of worms by practicing unlicensed therapy. I'm not a counselor. I'm not even necessarily a sponsee's friend. One of the questions that I'm sometimes asked is, can you sponsor someone that you don't like? And I'm here to report to you, apparently that's true. I sponsor a handful of people that I would never choose to hang out with socially, that I wouldn't necessarily invite to my home. But my job isn't to like them. My job is to love them enough to share the journey and to be honest with them. That is my obligation more than anything to my sponsees, is to love them. And sometimes we love people that we don't like. Anybody with teenage kids knows that feeling. In sponsorship, what we do is we serve as an example of how this thing can work. I try to be an example of someone who has recovered from a spiritual illness. Albert Schweitzer credited with saying that example, in trying to influence others, example is not the main thing. It is the only thing. And so this is what we do. We try to show people, as it talks about in Tradition 11, show how this program works rather than tell. I believe that the main job of the sponsor is to take the sponsee through the steps. The 12 steps are the thing that we are all about. CoDA is kind of a one-trick pony. If you take the steps out of what it is that we do, and basically what we are is bad group therapy. But there are other jobs that can fall under the auspices of sponsorship. So apart from taking the sponsee through the steps, One of the things that we deal with is living problems. I look at my sponsees and I encourage them when they have something come up in their lives that is affecting their illness or is affected by their illness, that they give me a call. And what's my obligation in that? My job at that moment is to share my experience, strength, and hope. How have I applied the steps, the traditions, the tools of the program to a similar experience in my life, and how did that work out? So that's what we do here. Another duty of a good sponsor, I think, is to help a sponsee understand the traditions. So by inference, I need to study the traditions if I want to be a good sponsor, so that I can help a sponsee to interpret them. Speaking of interpreting, another job that sometimes falls to the sponsor is to be an interpreter of the culture of what we do here, the culture of recovery. A newcomer comes in here, and from their point of view, we're almost talking a foreign language. Recovery is a lot like a foreign language. We have our jargon and our slogans, and a good sponsor will play translator for the sponsee. Related to that is even something as simple as meeting etiquette. To be able to take a sponsee aside after a meeting and say, a no crosstalk rule means that we don't interrupt what somebody else is sharing. Just something as simple as that. Hey, we've been dispensed with an entire page of notes. When the subject of sponsorship comes up with veteran members, people who've been around for a little while, one of the things we find is that it can be hard to find people willing and available to sponsor in CoDA. And when the subject comes up, why some people who've been around for a while are not sponsoring, there's a bunch of reasons that get expressed. This is out of sponsorship, what's in it for me. Many of us in Codependents Anonymous are unsure about our own ability to form healthy relationships. We wonder what we might possibly have to offer another person. The thought of becoming a sponsor may trigger our codependency issues. The ensuing agitation and anxiety may be unnerving. As a result, many of us hesitate to step forward. What I hear is, I'm afraid I'm insufficient to the task. Well, I think if that's your feeling, can I suggest that you talk to your sponsor? A good sponsor in that situation will perhaps help you to see the progress that you have made. One of the things that's been important for me from day one is to never trust my perception of where I'm at. I need to check in with my sponsor on stuff like that, because my illness has a tendency to oversell my deficiencies if I listen to it. Another thing that I hear is I'm afraid of screwing them up. Really? Afraid of screwing them up? I'm going to suggest to you that you probably can't. Let's think about that for a second. I don't care where you're at in your recovery. If they're sick enough that you look like a good idea, you can't harm them. Because all they're looking for is they're saying that they want what you've got. And when you get something better, hopefully they'll want that too. Here, I'm trying, I don't want to get involved in sponsorship because I'm trying to learn to be less controlling, not more. Well, then I would suggest to you that sponsorship is a great answer for that. One of the things that happens for us in the relationships that we form in these rooms is that we get, in the pursuit of healthy and loving relationships, we get the opportunity to practice new relationship behaviors. And if you're trying to be less controlling, then becoming a sponsor is a terrific opportunity to practice that. Ultimately, We sometimes hear, I don't want that much responsibility. I would submit to you that the biggest responsibility that you have as a sponsor is to be an example. The biggest responsibility you have as a sponsor is to walk the talk, to do what you say. And if you're afraid of that, then I'm going to suggest you have a chat with your sponsor. Why is it important, though, to be a sponsor? We have an entire booklet called Sponsorship, What's in It for Me? I think that's based entirely on the idea that you can never go wrong by appealing to a codependent self-interest. So what's in it for being a sponsor? Well, there's step 12, the idea that having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, I am so grateful. I am so jazzed about it that I want to pay back. The people who were there when I walked in the door saved my life. It turns out you can't pay somebody back for saving your life unless you can find a way to save their life. So what they want me to do is to pay it forward. And that's what sponsorship looks like. I want to be a sponsor because I've been through the steps several times. And I can keep going through the steps several times. And after a while, we hit the point of diminishing returns, having the same experience over and over and over and over again. And there's no growth in having the same experience. But if I sponsor people and I'm going through the steps with those guys, then I'm having a new experience every time. I want to be a sponsor because it encourages me to have a deeper understanding of the steps and the traditions and the tools of the program. Because as we all know, you don't really understand something until you can explain it to someone else. I want to be a sponsor because I want to honor our fifth tradition. Tradition 5 says that every CoDA group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to other codependents who still suffer. That's the tradition that says that the newcomer is the most important person in every room. It's the tradition that tells me that the reason we even have meetings is to give the newcomer someplace to find us. Think about it. Once you got here and you found a sponsor, could not pretty much everything that you've done since then in your recovery have been done at a kitchen table or at a coffee shop or over the phone with your sponsor? The reason we have the meetings is to give the newcomer someplace to find us. So it's honoring tradition 5 to make myself available to that newcomer. Another reason that I need to sponsor is for the growth. I grew through the first 11 steps. The epiphanies, the connect the dots moments, the insights that I gained into my life and the changes that loving higher power brought about contributed in getting me from a very dark place to a place where I was starting to feel peaceful. Then I started sponsoring people. And I discovered that at that point, the sky's the limit. That the growth available to me in sponsorship is apparently unlimited, and it dwarfs that very impressive to me growth that I experienced in the first 11 steps. See, here's what happens for me: is that I go through 4, I identify a bunch of defects of character. I go through step 5, I discuss that with my sponsor and come to a better understanding of the exact nature of my wrongs. And in step 6, I'm entirely ready to stop living that way. So in 7, I ask my higher power to remove that shortcoming. Now, my higher power, I don't know about yours, but the way my higher power works is he doesn't just snap his fingers and it's gone. He gives me opportunities to learn in order to gain some distance from that defective character. What he really likes to do is he likes to send that defective character across the floor of the meeting room to ask me to sponsor it. As some of you know, one of my favorite examples of that is that one time in my recovery during a 6-month period of time, 3 ordained ministers asked me to be their sponsor. Right. I got here a lifelong agnostic. I sit before you today, an agnostic with a higher power. And three guys who do God for a living somehow thought the lifelong agnostic was suited to be their spiritual guide. I don't know how that happens, other than somebody somewhere recognized that Richard's got a problem with organized religion. Richard's got a problem even just saying the G word, because that's how I said it. I couldn't say the word God in context in the sentence without stumbling over it. And here's a good way to ease him out of that. Let's let him talk to these three guys who he has to learn how to say God in a sentence in order to communicate with them. And that's how my higher power works. And the growth that I have experienced as a result of that is phenomenal. See, what happens is my higher power speaks to me through other people. And the people that he seems to find it easiest to speak through are people who tend to congregate in church basements once a week and sit in uncomfortable chairs and talk to each other. So here's the deal for me, is that I took the third step. I made a decision to try one day at a time to do the things that I think a loving higher power would have me do. So when he sends somebody across the room to me to ask if I will show him how to walk through this process, I consider that that's a direct message from my higher power. And I need to honor that decision I made in the third step. So how do you know when you're ready to sponsor? Well, there's a couple of ways. The simplest answer to that is when they ask you. At the point where you've got something that somebody else thinks they want, apparently they think you're ready. Our older booklet on sponsorship used to talk about, and this was written back in the days when there were really very few available sponsors in CoDA because it was a new fellowship. There was no such thing as a CoDA old timer, because I think that booklet was written when CoDA was about 7 years old. And it used to talk about the fifth step being the minimum requirement to become a sponsor. And that was on the theory that if you have accomplished 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, then you're far enough ahead of that newcomer that you can, at the very least, take them through the early steps, get them going on an inventory, and then all you need to do is work hard enough to stay one step ahead of them. So one of the things that I do, back up for 1 second. When I asked you to put an asterisk in front of your name if you're available to sponsor, that's something that we do in my home group. That we put a star in front of our name to indicate that we're willing to be a temporary sponsor. And it shows up on our group phone list. It shows up on our screen names on the Zoom meetings. And what I tell the guys that I sponsor when I take them through the fifth step is that I would like you to start putting an asterisk beside your name. I would like when I want to talk to the newcomer after the meeting to have to elbow you aside, because what this is all about now is to make ourselves available as sponsor for sponsorship. How do we make ourselves available? Well, like I say, get in front of the newcomer. Talk to the newcomer after the meeting. How was your first meeting? Do you have any questions about this thing? Can I help you in any way? What I tell the guys that have just gone through the fifth step is that, first of all, I tell them that they've now done more work in support of their own recovery than 95% of the people who ever walk in our doors, because it's true. If you think about the number of people who don't stick around long enough to actually get a sponsor and get involved in the steps. If you think about the people who can be around for a very long time, but they're afraid of doing the inventory work and they never get there. In my experience, the guys that I work with that get to the fifth step have done more work in support of their own recovery than 95% of the people we ever see. And so I tell them, welcome to the fellowship of the Spirit. It's time to start paying your dues. And I encourage them to become available for sponsorship. Something else that I do in service of that is I don't screen my phone calls. I know it's kind of become popular with all the scam calls that make the rounds these days that I don't pick up on phone numbers that I don't recognize. Well, the problem with that is that that's how the newcomer who wants to talk to me is gonna try to get a hold of me. He's not going to be in my contact list yet. I'm not going to recognize the number. And if I pick it up and it turns out that it's some scammer, I can hang up. I've learned to have those kinds of boundaries in CoDA. So what are the attributes of an effective sponsor? Sponsorship, what's in it for me? We talked about 3 weeks ago. We went through some of that exact question because there's 2 pages worth of stuff in sponsorship. What's in it for me? Things like good sponsor places their recovery first. You know, that idea that anything I put in front of my recovery, I am guaranteed to lose. That they actively work the 12 steps. I work the 12 steps on my own with my sponsor and with my sponsees. They exhibit a program of recovery that we want for ourselves. I think it's really important to remember that it doesn't matter who we are, where we are in our recovery, what we're doing, we're always an example of this thing. Everything that we do is an example. Sometimes we try to be a good example, but sometimes the best we can do is be a loud warning. But we are always an example, good, bad, or indifferent, of how this thing works. From the sponsee's point of view, it talks in here about they accept themselves and they accept us. CoDA has taught me to meet people where they are, to take that sponsee where they are, how they are, right here in this moment. We just came from a workshop on traditions 3 and 4. Tradition 3, that spiritual principle of inclusion, talks about not putting obstacles between ourselves and other people. So I try to practice that as a sponsor. That all that I ask of the guys that I sponsor is gentle, persistent effort. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I do not make it a requirement that they get better. Right? And I need to remember that the flip side of that. Step 12 says that having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to other codependents and to practice these principles in all affairs. It says we tried to carry this message. We're responsible for trying to carry the message. We are not responsible for them getting it. That, in a lot of cases, is up to their willingness and their higher power. So we did go through those characteristics 3 weeks ago. So I have a different list that I'd like to refer to. This is a list that I can't remember where I got it from, but I kind of think it came from Northern California. So I'm thinking Jim Y was probably involved. I got a laugh at Lisa. Jim Y is a really cool guy in Northern California, and he's just as passionate about sponsorship as I am. So this is labeled the 12 qualities of sponsorship. 1, I will not help you to stay and wallow in limbo. I think that speaks to that obligation of the sponsor to be honest enough, to love that sponsee enough to be honest and tell the truth of what I see. 2, I will help you to grow, to become more productive by your definition. 3, I will help you become more autonomous, more loving of yourself, more excited, less sensitive, more free to become the authority for your own living. Kind of speaks to tradition 4 and the something that talked about in that last workshop. The idea that as a sponsor, I can't tell a sponsee what to do. He's autonomous. He gets to make decisions about his life. I get to make suggestions. I get to make observations. I get to say what I see. 4, I cannot give you dreams or fix you up simply because I cannot. The idea that the sponsee is responsible for their recovery. 5, I cannot give you growth or grow for you. You must grow for yourself by facing reality, grim as it may be at times. 6, I cannot take away your loneliness or your pain. Sometimes the very best that I can do is just listen. And I'm grateful that sometimes that's exactly what's required. 7, I cannot sense your world for you, evaluate your goals for you, tell you what is best for your world because you have your own world in which you must live. 8, I cannot convince you of the necessity to make the vital decision of choosing the frightening uncertainty of growth over the safe misery of remaining static. My sponsor tells me all the time, Richard, you will never, ever, ever change a thing unless and until the discomfort of the status quo outweighs the fear of uncertainty, the fear of changing. 9, I want to be with you and know you as a rich and growing friend, yet I cannot get close to you when you choose not to grow. Sometimes we have that sponsee who just is unwilling to take the necessary actions. In which case, what I tend to do with that is to just be patient, to accept them at where they are, and to invest my energy in the people who are willing. And hopefully that person gets to a point where they are willing to do something different. Because at the end of the day, that's all recovery is about, is doing something different. We talk here about if you want what you always got, do what you always did. Or, if your life is going perfectly, if you love your job, you've got a great marriage, your kids are doing great, your family is fabulous, we suggest you don't change a thing. But if one or more of those areas is giving you some trouble, you might want to do something different. 10, when I begin to care for you out of pity, or when I begin to lose faith in you, that I am inhibiting both for you and for me. That speaks to the occasion where we sometimes need to recognize as sponsors when we're not helping somebody, when it may be best to be able to help them look around and find someone whose style is better suited for them. It's really important to me to not let my ego be attached to being anyone, to being the sponsor for any particular person. And in fact, one of the best messages I can get from the sponsee is that I've helped them to outgrow me. 11, you must know and understand my help is conditional. I will be with you and hang in there with you so long as I continue to get even the slightest hint that you are still trying to grow. 12, if you can accept this, then perhaps we can help each other to become what God meant us to be, mature adults, leaving childishness forever to the little children of the world. Now, we talk a lot about about the inner child in CoDA. I can tell you from my experience that my inner child was running things for decades, and he was really making a mess of it. What I've been trying to do for the last 18 years is to get in touch with my inner adult. Give my inner child a break. So that's another perspective on the qualities of a good sponsorship, or a good sponsor. Okay, so you've been in recovery for a little while, you've made some progress, and someone just walked up and said, I love the recovery that I see in you. Would you please show me how to do this? What do you do? Well, for starters, can I suggest that you pray on it and talk to your sponsor? I can tell you that I said earlier that we sponsor the way we've been sponsored and the way we've been brought up in recovery by our sponsor. So consequently, the acceptable answer from me when someone asks that question is I'd be honored. I need to remember that I took the third step. My higher power speaks to me through other people. And when my higher power sends his messenger across the floor to ask me for help, I need to honor that third step decision. With that said, I tag on to that. But first, we're going to go and find a cup of coffee somewhere and have a little chat. And we're going to give you a chance to back out. And that is because I have some requests, some requirements of my sponsees. Maybe you do too. What we do is we sit down for what I think of as the talk. And what I tell that guy is that I spent most of my life in the 12th step these days, and therefore the quality of my recovery depends on the guys that I work with. I want to work with people who want to do this. So there are some things that I'm going to ask of you. First of all, you need to understand that presumably you're asking me because you want what I've got. This thing has always been built on, if you want what we've got, do what we did. And the only thing that I have to share is my experience, strength, and hope, what I've done, which means that since anything good in my life is a result of working steps and practicing the 12 traditions, I'm a steps and traditions guy. That's the big deal that I have to offer you, is the 12 steps, the 12 traditions. And if that appeals to you, then we've got a basis for continuing this conversation. If you're looking for something else, anything else at all, I may not be the right guy. I also ask the guys that I sponsor something I refer to as gentle, persistent effort. I mentioned that earlier. Gentle. We need to remember that in codependence, we're often very hard on ourselves. And we're not trying to get better all at once here. We're not trying to set any speed records. We're not trying to sprain something. So we need to learn to be gentle with self, but at the same time, persistent effort. That idea of continuing to put one foot in front of the other, being willing to get off the couch and do something in support of my own recovery. I made a commitment to myself in early recovery that I would try to do something significant every day in support of my own recovery. And I've more or less kept that promise for 18 years. Some days, what that looks like is sitting down and doing some step work. Sometimes it is calling my sponsor. Sometimes it's taking a call from the sponsee. Sometimes it's coming here and sharing with people like you. But doing something every day that at the end of the day I can point at and say, okay, I moved the goalposts on my recovery just a little bit here today. I ask the guys that I sponsor to honor the purpose of the meetings. That what I was referring to earlier, the meetings are there for the benefit of the newcomer. The meetings are there for us to share our experience, strength, and hope with the newcomer. The meetings are not about my problems. I never, to the best of my ability, take my problems to the meeting, unless I also bring my solutions. So in a meeting, you might hear from me, this is what's been going on in my life, and I talked to my sponsor, and this is what we worked out that I would do about it, and this is how it turned out. That's experience, strength, and hope. You might hear from me, this is what's been going on in my life, and I've talked to my sponsor, and this is what I'm going to do about it, and this is how I hope it turns out. That qualifies as experience, strength, and hope. But what I hope you never, ever hear from me in a meeting is, this is what's been going on in my life, and I don't know what to do, and I'm fucked. Because that's experience, and experience. And I don't know how that's helpful to the newcomer. When I made that change in early recovery, you know what happened to the meetings was they got better for me. That's a huge part of my experience. So I strongly suggest that my sponsees do that if they want what I've got. I tell my sponsees that I can't tell you what to do, but I'm going to make lots of suggestions. And you need to understand that you are absolutely free to ignore any suggestion I ever make. I can't make decisions for you. But if we should ever happen to notice that you, the sponsee, are ignoring pretty much every suggestion that I, the sponsor, am making, I would hope that one of us is smart enough to question the point of this relationship. And at that point, I am more than happy to look around the landscape in these rooms and see if we can find somebody else who can help you, because apparently it's not me. So those are the kind of things that I lay out after I have committed to be someone's sponsor, but before they have finished thinking it over and committed to be the sponsee. Is it ever appropriate to say no? Yeah, sometimes. One of the most common is if you're legitimately overloaded, if you just do not have time in your life for one more sponsee. I can tell you that my higher power is pretty good about not overloading me. And I sometimes get asked, how many people do you sponsor, Richard? I honestly don't know. I have a bunch of guys that I get to work with on a regular basis and I get to sponsor them. And then I've got a bunch of guys who call me their sponsor, but they never call me. And I hope that they'll let me sponsor them eventually. But if they just want to call me their sponsor, that's okay with me. But ultimately, I like my sponsor's answer to that same question. Somebody goes, Jack, how many people do you sponsor? He says, one at a time, the one in front of me. And what I find is that as long as I am trying to adhere to the will of a loving higher power, my higher power does not overload me. I find that in practice, I generally only have 2 or 3 really newcomers at a time. Those tend to be the sponsees that are high maintenance. Once we can get them through the first few steps and get them into the heavy paperwork steps, then they go away and write for a while and they become much lower maintenance. Once they get past the 5th step, they become even lower maintenance. Then there's a little blip somewhere in there when they start sponsoring people and I start getting phone calls saying, Richard, I got this sponsee and this is what's going on in their life and what should I tell them? But then they get past that little speed bump and they become really low maintenance. And what I find is that my higher power has never given me more than I can handle as long as I'm willing. Other times, we have in our literature the idea that in general men sponsor men and women sponsor women. And I mean, we've had discussions at CSC about how gender is in some cases a really confusing circumstance in our fellowship. But at the end of the day, what we want to avoid is any sponsorship relationship where there's any risk of romantic entanglement, whatever that looks like for you. At the end of the day, people sponsor people. Another circumstance that would be inappropriate is if there is baggage, pre-existing baggage in that relationship. When I was about 3 years in recovery, a woman showed up in my home group and asked me to sponsor her. And she was the drug-addicted former prostitute that my ex-wife had had an affair with the week after I left the house. That just felt a little uncomfortable, and I found it necessary to say no. So you just got a new sponsee. What's next? Well, can I suggest that you get them going on the steps? At the end of the day, the first 3 steps are pretty straightforward. The purpose of step 1 is to get that sponsee in touch with the problem. And a good paraphrase of step 1 is that I've got a problem so big it's beyond my capacity to solve. Whatever it takes to get them there. I like to work with patterns of codependence. I have sponsees look at those patterns of codependence, recognize them in their lives. I encourage them to look at whether they've tried to stop doing those things. And have they been successful in stopping? Because if they come face to face with the idea that this has become a compulsion in my life, a compulsive behavior, I can't not do it. Well, that's a pretty good step 1. Step 2 says there is a power that can solve the problem. And whatever that looks like, I'm lifelong agnostic. I think being an agnostic is a great starting point for this program, because what it means is I don't know. There's these people who talk to the guy hanging on a cross up on the wall in those buildings, and maybe they have it right. I don't know. There's the people who read the Quran on a regular basis, and maybe they have it right. I don't know. There's the indigenous populations in North America, and they talk about this great spirit in the sky. And maybe they got a handle on it. I don't know. And what that let the people in my early recovery do is to gently introduce me to the idea that this higher power is of my own understanding. They let me write a job description. What are the characteristics a higher power needs to have in order for me to be able to get better? And when I could do that, then the 3rd step became easy. First step creates the need for the 2nd step. I got a problem. I need a solution. There's a potential solution. The 3rd step's a no-brainer. Give the solution a try. I like to really stress with sponsees that idea that many of you have heard from me several times in this meeting before that we're not required to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God in our third step. We're just required to decide it's a good idea. We're required to make a decision. And 4 through 12 are about acting on that decision. So I find it pretty comfortable to walk a sponsee through those first 3 steps, as long as I keep them simple and remember to focus on their purpose. Some other methods of taking a sponsee through the first 3 steps that are pretty popular. Coming out of Northern California, I think it got conference endorsed, is the 30 questions. Has that been conference endorsed, Lisa? Or it was just still in the works? Okay, maybe it's still
I believe it's still in the works. I don't know for sure. I know they posted at the outreach section as available for people to utilize.
Okay, perfect. So that's a structured approach to looking at the first 3 steps. It's a workbook approach. I'm not big on workbook approaches personally, but your mileage may vary. And if that works for you, great. Similar to that, coming out of Australia is a document called the first 14 days. And really it's all about step 1. But at the end of the day, the best thing that you can do as a sponsor, show them what you did, whatever that looks like, because that's the best thing you have to share. Apart from getting them going on the steps, we'll probably want to start teaching them a little bit about the traditions and having those kinds of conversations. And as many of you know, I'm firmly of the belief that if this is the fellowship where the only requirement for membership is a desire for healthy and loving relationships, then I believe the traditions are at least as important as the steps. I also know from experience and observation that the 12 steps are kind of a prerequisite. I've not seen anybody be very successful with the traditions until they've worked the steps. But we want to talk about the traditions as well. Another one that I've been finding really useful is to take sponsees through the 12 promises after they've been around for a little while, and show them those milestones in their recovery, and show them how they can use those 12 promises as tools to enhance their recovery. The other thing that I do with a brand new sponsee is I give them a backup list. I like to give a new sponsee a list with 3 or 4 names and phone numbers. If there's something going on in your life, you call me. But I'm not available 24/7, 365. And this is a list of people that if you can't reach me and there's something going on, I would like you to call these guys, because there's someone I trust you with. And they're typically people that I respect in recovery, or that I also sponsor, and I encourage them to actually get to know those people before a crisis. I'll tell them, in the next 2 weeks, try to have a get acquainted conversation with each one of those people, so that if you ever do have to call them in the midst of a crisis, you're not calling a stranger. Another big area, though, that we end up dealing with as sponsors is what we refer to as living problems. That is when something's going on. And I encourage sponsees to take their judgment off the table. One of the worst things that happens is, I talked about this, I think, in the last session as well, that codependents caught up in low self-esteem will look at what's going on in their life, and their head's exploding, but they look at that and go, I can't call Richard, he's too busy, or this isn't important enough to call Richard with. It's like, no, we already established that your judgment about your problem sucks. So let's remove that. If the thought comes to you that maybe I should talk to Richard about this, reach out. And if you can't reach me, one of these guys. When I get those calls, this is strictly me. I don't listen for the first 30 seconds. It's been my experience that they never say anything important in the first 30 seconds. They are setting the stage for the problem in that first 30 seconds. So I take that opportunity to pray. I ask my higher power to be with us. Help me to hear what it is that I need to hear, and to say what it is that I need to say, so that this man can say what he needs to say and hear what he needs to hear. And then I come back to the conversation and we have a talk. One of the most important things that I'm looking for in the course of that conversation is, what's he afraid of? Because he's almost always going to be afraid of something. Codependence is depressingly consistent. Our circumstances change, but the feelings are the same. And self-centered fear is the chief activator of all of my defects of character. So I'm trying to listen for what he's afraid of. And I look for, where have I had a similar situation in my life so that I can share my experience, strength, and hope? How have I applied the steps, the traditions, the tools of the program to the same kind of thing in my life? How did it turn out? If I can't find something similar in my experience, then I rack my brain looking around my friends, my acquaintances in recovery, to find somebody that I can refer it to. Because I'm not asked to share my opinions here. I'm asked to share my experience, strength, and hope. And if I don't have experience, I need to be honest with both him and myself about that. In order to find out what's actually going on, I find and or lead a sponsee to an insight that will help. I find that one of the most common things that I do is to ask leading questions. It may sound smart-ass, but I ask a lot of questions that I already know the answer to. The thing is that I need him to say the answer. Because if he says the answer, he's bought into it. If I tell him the answer, then he's just being told one more time by some outside voice. But if he comes up with the answer, he's got some ownership of it. So leading questions are one of the most powerful tools in recovery, as I learned from my sponsor, who is even bigger smartass than I am. Sponsorship and boundaries. What are inappropriate requests to make of a sponsor? First of all, that thing with the phone calls. When I tell the sponsee that I want to remove his judgment from that entire equation, one of the things that I like to point out is that by becoming sponsors, that's one of the places that I learned boundaries. It was by being a sponsor that I picked up the capacity to be able to say to somebody, this is not a good time for me to talk. Can I call you back in a half an hour? I'm out on date night with my wife. Can you call one of the other guys? Or even just to not pick up the phone and send a text saying I'm unavailable. I didn't have that capacity before. If the phone rang, I had to answer it. And and if it was somebody in a crisis, I had to take a call no matter what was going on around me. So I learned boundaries by being a sponsor. What are inappropriate requests to make of a sponsor? Well, I said before, I'm not a therapist. When somebody's pushing me to diagnose them, that's beyond my capacity. And I'm going to suggest that if that's what they're looking for, then maybe they need to get some outside help. But let's get back to the steps and the traditions. Another thing that I won't do is sponsorship by text. And that's from experience. I think that SMS text and social media are toxic to recovery. In Richard's fantasy world, sponsors have the ability to remove all social media and a cell phone from the sponsee for a period of 6 months. But I know that doesn't happen. I don't have that right, but I sure, my sponsor tells me, Richard, it's okay to want to. Because we get into such trouble with that stuff. I've lost count of the number of times that I've got a call from the sponsee and it's been a miscommunication between him and someone in his life over text. It is a horrible environment to communicate. So when I get the 3-page texts from a sponsee, my reply is usually, looks like this needs a phone call. because at least then I have tone of voice and I can interpret what's actually going on. You cannot pick up the nuances in a text. I'm also not a babysitter. I sponsor grown-ups. What that means is that when I make suggestions to a sponsee, when I give instructions for working a step to a sponsee, I don't attach a deadline. That's up to them. Everybody works at their own pace. I find that it works better for them if they work at their own pace. If they are expressing frustration over a lack of progress, then we may talk about how to overcome that lack of progress. But the worst they will ever get from me for nagging to get step work done is once in a while in a meeting, I might say to them, how's your paperwork coming? And the final thing I want to touch on is can we and how can we break up with a sponsee? Ultimately, the goal of this relationship is to enhance both our recovery. And I think that if it has become apparent again and again and again that there's no progress being made, it's time for someone to face reality that this guy needs a different sponsor. I had a conversation a few years back with a young guy where he called me because of her in his life said or done something that upset him. And I had to say to him, I've noticed a pattern. The her in your life says or does something and you get upset and you call me and we talk it out and I make some suggestions and you agree that those are some very good suggestions and you go off to implement those suggestions and then you have a better idea. And then sometime later you call me up and you're upset because of something that she said or something that she did and we talk it out and I make some suggestions and you say those are very good suggestions and you go off to implement those suggestions and then you have a better idea. I got to say, I don't think I'm helping you. So why don't we have a look around and see if we can find somebody who's better suited, because clearly I'm not it. And I think that's legitimate because, as I said before, the quality of my 12th step and therefore the quality of my recovery depends on the guys that I work with. I want to work with guys that I can help. So that's pretty much everything that I want to say about sponsorship in general. But I do want to read you something. I do and I don't. I have never once got through this document out loud without crying. Today may be the first time. We'll see what happens. But this is a document that speaks directly to why I sponsor. It's a poem written by a guy named Sam Shoemaker. And those of you who are familiar with recovery history will recognize that name as the guy who was the vicar of Calvary Church in the Bowery in New York City, where Bill Wilson got sober. Bill Wilson was, of course, one of the co-founders of AA and the guy who's responsible for all of this stuff that we've inherited. So this speaks directly to me. It's entitled, I Stand by the Door. I stand by the door. I neither go too far in nor stay too far out. The door is the most important door in the world. It is the door through which men walk when they find God. There's no use my going way inside and staying there when so many are still outside, and they, as much as I, crave to know where the door is. And all that so many ever find is only the wall where the door ought to be. They creep along the wall like blind men with outstretched, groping hands, feeling for a door, knowing there must be a door, yet they never find it. So I stand by the door. The most tremendous thing in the world is for men to find that door, the door to God. The most important thing that any man can do is to take hold of one of those blind, groping hands. Today's not the day. And put it on the latch that only clicks and opens to the man's own touch. Men die outside the door, as starving beggars die on cold nights in cruel cities in the dead of winter, die for want of what is within their grasp. They live on the other side of it because they've not found it. Nothing else matters compared to helping them find it. and open it and walk in and find him. So I stand by the door. Go in, great saints. Go all the way in. Go way down in the cavernous cellars and way up into the spacious attics. It is a vast, roomy house, this house where God is. Go into the deepest of hidden casements of withdrawal, of silence, of sainthood. Some must inhabit those inner rooms and know the depths and heights of God and call outside to the rest of us how wonderful it is. Sometimes I take a deeper look in. Sometimes I venture in a little further, but my place seems closer to the opening, so I stand by the door. That's not all of it. There's another reason why I stand there. Some people get partway in and become afraid lest God and the zeal of his house devour them, for God is so very great and asks all of us. And these people feel a cosmic claustrophobia and want to get out. Let me out, they cry. And the people way inside only terrify them more. Somebody must be by the door to tell them that they are spoiled for the old life. They've seen too much. One taste of God and nothing but God will do anymore. Somebody must be watching for the frightened who seek to sneak out just where they came in, to tell them how much better it is inside. The people too far in do not see how near these are to leaving, preoccupied with the wonder of it all. Somebody must watch for those who have entered the door but would like to run away. So for them too, I stand by the door. I admire the people who go all the way in, but I wish they would not forget how it was before they got in. Then they would be able to help the people who have not yet even found the door, or the people who want to run away again from God. You can go in too deeply and stay in too long and forget the people outside the door. As for me, I shall take my old accustomed place, near enough to God to hear him and know he is here, he is there, but not so far from men as to not hear them and remember they are there too. Where? Outside the door. Thousands of them, millions of them. But more important for me, one of them, two of them, 10 of them, whose hands I'm intended to put on the latch. So I will stand by the door and wait for those who seek it. I'd rather be a doorkeeper, so I stand by the door. Thanks for letting me share, everybody.